Welcome, everyone. So I will just say a brief welcome on behalf of the Truth and Reconciliation Week team. And we're glad to be having this session on institutional harassment with Royston. And Royston is going to introduce himself, but I will quickly say that most of you know by now, if you can familiarize yourself with the on and off of your video and audio settings. And we welcome you to keep on your video if you like during the session, but please do mute yourself while you're not speaking. And with that, I will hand it to Royston.
Well, most importantly, welcome. I'm speaking from a hot summer's day in Switzerland, in a place called Vevey. I should put as a backcloth that I'm a dyslexic polymath, so I've experienced various forms of harassment all my life. And that's really been a stimulus to maybe to look at this in a bit more detail. I recently gave a statement to the OHCHR on this topic, and it seems to be uncharted territory in some ways in terms of the Human Rights Council. But I thought it was an opportunity to come and share your story and to explore new modalities. Juliana, could I have another slide? In terms of trying to understand institutional harassment, basically its focus is where there's a power imbalance. In other words, the organization has a very considerable power, and the individual exposed to the harassment has relatively little power, so that their locus of control and locus of concern is completely out of balance. Institutional harassment is now recognized and under human rights and development, and they're challenged by the institution in physical intelligence terms, they're challenged in emotional intelligence terms, in terms of systems and processes and decisions that mostly are unfair and unreasonable and particularly damaging relationships. Often there's no explanation for these harmful actions, which are repeated in a sort of almost like a mechanistic system. And finally, there's a breakdown of trust between both individuals and groups to the point where it can involve people committing suicide or massively disruptive family situations. Next. Back one, okay. So in CSPOC, we're a United Nations accredited NGO focused on developing self-sustaining solutions by integrating health, education, and enterprise to deliver the environment, citizenship, and value generation. And in terms of celebrating diversity and inclusion, I think it really is focusing on this notion of a duty of care, both of individuals and institutions, to recognize what the impact of what they're doing. I think the Nuremberg trials showed that just obeying orders is no longer a defense, and also ignorance is no longer a defense. So it's about trying to go back to core values and virtues, and we say particularly compassion, patience, tolerance, humility, and sharing as core virtues, and to be joyful, responsible, respectful, safe, and trustworthy as values. Next. So what happens to people when they get exposed to forces which are outside of their control? We find that the key challenge is individual self-worth. And as their self-worth gets challenged and they start to feel less and less valuable, they increasingly move into displacement activities, which we see as violence, eating disorders, substance abuse, gang cultures, and gang cultures exist in institutions as well, where people gang up on the more vulnerable. And eventually you end up in this place called learned helplessness, where you are unable to cope and positive and negative interactions have no effect on you. And this is where quite a few people are challenged and commit suicide. And one of the ways of, which is quite severe, of measuring institutional harassment is the number of people that commit suicide. But we find that the converse is also true. If you can lift self-worth so people feel secure, they can move into this place of learned optimism, and they start to work together more effectively as teams and help each other. Next. So examples of institutional harassment that we've observed, and you may have some yourself. In the health sphere, we see the abuse of medical power, where the individual is often not fully informed of the risks of procedures or medication. In the enterprise sector, we see unfair restructuring, and this has taken place. An example is France Telecom, where 19 people committed suicide in a restructuring, and they were taken to international court by the International Labour Organization, and the directors were put in jail. So, I mean, the judicial outcome is there's very substantial liabilities. Education, again, we see learning through abuse and systematic rigidity. As a dyslexic, I can say that I have had many dark nights of the soul going through the education system. My daughter's dyslexic, my son's dyslexic, I think my father was dyslexic. So it's a rather interesting adventure. And paradoxically, I was asked by the National Audit Office to do a review of primary education. In litigation in terms of divorce, we find that family courts are really a law unto themselves. And Clementi in Spain did an analysis, and he created a legal harassment scale now, where the judicial system can be actually measured as to whether they're being reasonable or not reasonable. In the public agencies, many people have heard about the system being more important than people, and benefits being taken away quite arbitrarily. And there are a number of monitored measurements of suicide that have happened right across the piece, particularly with people that are disabled and suddenly have their benefits taken away on the basis they're not disabled enough. And I think the new frontier in institutional harassment is the social media, where this can be a massive intrusion into the personal space. We hear of young children being harassed to the point of committing suicide. We see people in the public spotlight being harassed to a point where they don't feel they can cope anymore. And Amy Winehouse might well be an example of that sort of social media harassment. Next. So what I would like you to do now is to perhaps go into a breakout group and firstly introduce yourself as to who you are. Have you had any personal experience of institutional harassment? And what did you do about it? One of the challenges we now face is that if you are a whistleblower, you don't necessarily have protection. You put your story to a newspaper article, what have you, and then if asked, the newspaper will release your name and details. And many people are getting fired as a result of that. But please, would you share in the group your own experiences of institutional harassment? We've got about 4 minutes per person, a 12-minute session. Okay? Okay, well, perhaps we can move on to the next slide, Juliana. So we've talked about what institutional harassment might well be, and it means different things to different people. And we've also explored the possibility of there's also internal harassment, where you harass yourself, which is another dimension to it. So where did Truth and Reconciliation start? Well, really, it began at the end of the apartheid sort of challenge in South Africa with Nelson Mandela, where there was such a level of toxic thought between the Afrikaans community, the ANC, and so on, that any normal mechanism of conflict would have been absolutely unthinkable. And therefore, this Truth and Reconciliation process started. And over the years, it's had varying degrees of success, but fundamentally, its vision was to heal the past without conflict. And then more recently, we've had the examples in Canada where very large numbers of children have been discovered close to residential schools, where Indigenous community were taken to these schools to be indoctrinated and destroy their culture. I think that's also been the case in Australia with the Aboriginal communities, and it's probably also the case with the Dakota Sioux, and these are only the ones that we know about. I think in the case of Canada, I think more than 1,000 children have now been discovered in unmarked graves. And this process of taking away land, destroying language, and destroying kinship is really a crime against humanity that we're just beginning to you can't actually cover pain with more pain. You have to find out some other mechanism. So we can have the slide. In the case of Truth and Reconciliation, there's been a huge amount of research and analysis, and there's been a deep and sustained dialogue between all the parties concerned to try and find some ways of discovering and understanding what has actually happened, and then communicate that and become an advocacy so it doesn't happen again, or where there are have happened, they're explored. And it's all about mobilizing, training, and empowering the people involved to find a peaceful solution. Next slide. This is a somewhat unusual slide, but my view is if you have truth and reconciliation, there's something in the middle, which is justice. And justice is really about trying to find balance and making appropriate interventions. Now, in every situation, there's some form of context, which is an introspective journey about why it's happened. And we explore the competencies of the people in making very difficult decisions where they, clearly where the children were taken away in Canada, the people doing it had some sort of a model that they were using. It may have been a misguided model, but we need to understand how they got to that model. The second thing is really, how do you explain that they left to this one side, this whole area of compassion? These children were children. They weren't animals. They were just, but the compassion seems to have disappeared. And then I guess the manifestation, which is around what is the social impact of these decisions? What is the social impact of taking away children from their community? What is the social impact of having a distorted view of ethnicity and that one group is better than another? So we need to find some mechanism where we create agency, agility, and we accelerate this process to find solutions quickly. And justice should be smooth and appropriate and not extended over huge periods of time. So may I have another slide? So what I think we really have in this truth and reconciliation conversation is about three elements. There's truth, which is shining the light in the dark places. And I think Martin Luther King said it so well: darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. So I think that's it's clear that we've got to actually look at these difficult situations that occur. Secondly, really justice is about finding clarity and balance. Again, Martin Luther had the same sort of view. He said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So we have to recognize that in looking at these difficult situations, the only way of dealing with them is to find clarity and balance so that we don't take inappropriate actions. And then the last element, which is reconciliation, which is what do you do about repairing damage? How do you try and avoid it happening again? And how, I think, as we've said before in the conversation today, is how do you make topics appropriate, that they are talked about, because people do get into very difficult places and never realize that they're being harassed. So the time is always right to do what is right, I believe. And this is what Martin Luther King said, that you can't run away from it. You have a right of responsibility to deal with things and a duty of care. You can't just ignore the moral compass. And our lives begin and end the day we become silent about this matter. So there are no passengers. You have to speak your truth, have to observe what is going on. And if necessary, you have to stand up and make a difference. The next slide. So I wanted to go into another breakout session. Again, just introduce yourself. And have you had any experience of institutional injustice, where you actually felt that you were heard and valued and respected and listened to, and that the organization changed as a result of that? And what did you do about it? So can we pass into the breakout groups? Okay, let's try and explore a possible way forward through this journey of truth, justice, and reconciliation. And this slide may sound a little bit complicated, but it's really that we all have physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual intelligences anchored at one end by the world and anchored at the other end by our virtues, values, vision, and volition. And if we have an inner journey and an outer journey, and we've actually talked about part of the biggest challenge in dealing with harassment and finding truth and justice and reconciliation is the process of finding justice, truth, and reconciliation in ourselves. So the first physical level is you have to acknowledge what needs to be solved, and let go of the pain. You have to bond with the people around you, even and yourself, your own emotional intelligence. You have to listen. And you have to find this secure base of trust where you trust yourself and you trust the system around you. And then you can start this outer journey, which is the law of reciprocity, which is this notion of giving and receiving, trying to understand things from other people's mind's eye, as well as trying to look at yourself in a more contemplative way to see how you can change. You need to value feelings in yourself in terms of your own emotional intelligence. And finally, find compromise so that there is no one solution in any truth, justice, and reconciliation process. It's all about compromises. It's all about finding balance. And finally, this is an interactive process, which is a continuous spiral where you see the world, you reflect on it, and you act. And it is just a continuous journey. Can I have the next slide? Now, this might be a bit alarming, but fundamentally, I think it's about love. It's about loving yourself. It's loving the people around you. The Nash equilibrium says that things only work if you look after yourself and you look after the system of which you're part. So I suppose the classic example would be the romantic space, where people come together. There's a physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual exchange, but it's very much an outer journey. And of course, it fades. It has to continually be redeveloped and re-energized. And you find this in institutions as well. You find that people are flavor of the month at one point. They can be excluded, they can be labeled, and they can be abused. And understanding how these different physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual interactions occur gives you a part of a way of co-creating a different space, a space of love as a space of fear. And then moving on from that, as you begin to develop a safe haven, you develop a notion of companion space, which is where you recognize that people can be different. They can have different views. They can have different perspectives. They can have different ethnicity and disabilities and so on. But they're all valuable as human beings, and they all have potential to evolve. And this is the companion space where we move into co-evolution. And I think if we can find a mechanism where trust, justice, and reconciliation can move into this pro-evolution space rather than just procreation, which tends to always require change, then I think we're beginning to move forward in a more productive way. But it means everybody has to take their role in this. And I think women are incredibly important because they're the anchors in the family, they're the anchors in the community, and particularly when they become grandmothers. Grandmothers are a formidable force in communities. Nobody will say no to a grandmother, because even the worst dictator in the world becomes a sniveling child if they're in a room with a grandmother for more than about 10 minutes. And we find that grandmothers can change things. I mean, we found that in a city in the UK with problems of crime, prostitution, drugs, violence, the grandmothers said they'd had enough, and it all stopped in 6 months. In another part of the UK, there was massive fracking problems of oil fracking causing earth movements and so on. The grandmothers, which called themselves the Lancashire Nans, said, we've had enough of this, and it all stopped in 6 months, even against the most formidable international corporations. And I think as you look around communities, you'll see that the grandmothers often have the real power, but yet it's not really recognized. And of course, you have to go through the tribal leadership, which is usually operated by men, but this power of the grandmothers is actually formidable. So we need to find ways of having a conversation about that and about activating it in communities so that we end this institutional and internal harassment that's been going on for so long. And we have a chance of having a better and more harmonious world. Next slide. And we're coming to the conclusion that in trying to make sense of all this, so CSPOC's view of an institutional harassment model is about recognizing there are transgenerational perspectives. You know, people see things in different ways, and they think often that their particular perspective is right and it's the only perspective. But we need to find ways to explore and mitigate in ways that aggregate dysfunction and look at ways that promote harmony. And this is a transgenerational perspective of all age groups, all experience groups, and it's about conversation. I remember in the United Nations, they said they did something novel the other day. The DG2s, that's the one under the Director Generals, had a meeting where they actually talked to each other. This was the first time. So it is about talking across these different dimensions, which may be age, there may be gender, there may be experience, there may be ethnicity, and considering the fiscal and social impact of not working together. And I think women are the wisdom keepers. They're the agents of possibility, as Christian would say. And this is our future. What's really remarkable in the Ikigai community in Japan is they found a way of bringing together these physical vocation, emotional passion, professional IQ, intelligence and missions, spiritual intelligence dimensions to work in a community so everybody exists in harmony. And I think we have to find a better way of looking at how communities interrelate and to work together. And our view is if you can get communities down to small communities of about 500 people, and that's true whether they're in a city or a village, or villages in a city, if you like, and a better understanding of human geography, this will be critical in traversing these both natural and complex disasters. I mean, we require new thinking that changes these old mindsets and rules, and a way of challenging the morbidity of communities without actually causing conflict. And this can only, I believe, be through this process of truth, justice, and reconciliation. So next slide. So lastly, I'd like to just go back to you and look at your personal reflections from all this. How will you change? What are you going to do today or tomorrow or the next day to make a difference in terms of the way you deal with this truth, justice, and reconciliation thought process? Okay, so I think we've now reached the end. I mean, Juliana, do you have the last slide? I think it is. So this is where I live in Switzerland, in a place called Vevey on Lac Le Mans, which is noted for naked women riding seahorses. But apart from that, it's an interesting diversion, but it's a very beautiful area, and I walk along the front every day. So all the very best, and it's a real delight to meet you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
This navigation.
Bye. Yeah.
God bless.
Bye. Thank you very much.